So we're gonna start recording. So thank you guys for coming. Next month, we were just talking, our talk is Thursday, March 16th on the Revolutionary War. So that will be the upcoming one. Tonight's is about the historic signs of Germantown. Last month, we did the ice houses. So we're on to great subjects here. And so Tom, we want to ask them the question, the trivia question. So if you do get this right, you guys can say the answer, or should we have them put it in the chat? Put it in the chat. Fast fingers here. $10 gift card to Otto's, the first one that answers correctly.
All right. So we start every one of these with a trivia question now. The trivia question is, what happened on November 14th, 1923? It's a big event in Germantown history. Put it in the chat. First one to get it right, get a gift card to Otto's.
Oh. Is it Ferrone? Got it. Good job. Tom did post about it yesterday if you're not following him on
Instagram.
The Instagram. So great story. So maybe you can kind of lead with that for a little bit in case we have someone's not following. Just a little talk about the fire quickly.
Yeah, so I mean that's one of the big things that happened in 1923 in Germantown. The other big notable event in 1923 was the school board of Germantown voted to both consolidate and purchase the first 6 acres of Germantown Central School and begin building what became Germantown Central School. The first students would attend the following year in 1924. But those are the big events from 1923 in Germantown.
It's good information. All right, so I'm going to let Tom take it away.
All right.
Thanks for joining, everyone.
All right, so I got into this subject in detail last year. I had a table out at the July 4th fireworks in Germantown and raised just about $200 in donations at the table there, and used that money to purchase oil-based paint to repaint 27 New York State historic signs in Germantown, Livingston, and Claremont, New York. And learned a lot about the process, and came to realize that some of the wording on some of these signs from the old days from 1932, a lot of them are from, some of the wording is a little misleading or, just lacking a little bit in context. But later in the year 2022, I had a chance to write a grant to get 3 new historic signs for Germantown. 2 of them had fallen down and need replacement, and one is just so inaccurate that I wanted to replace it as well. And during that grant writing process, I got a little bit of a taste of my own medicine, because it's very difficult to write these signs in the first place, because you only get 27 characters per line. You get 5 lines to work with. So I'll start with a little bit of the history behind the 8 historic signs in Germantown, New York. This one is in the Cheviot Cemetery, right at the corner of Cheviot Road and Cheviot Road Extension in Germantown. And this one was put up in 1932. In that time, it costs, I believe, $2. A town historian or a town supervisor could apply to the state education department and get a sign put up for $2 for a sign. And in some cases, the Office of the New York State Historian has files on some of these signs, but in the vast majority of cases, there's either no file or the file is empty. So this one is the site of East Camp, and it is correct, it was settled by Palatines in 1710. This particular village at the corner of Cheviot Road Extension, that was known as Hunterstown in 1710. East Camp referred to the entire 4 villages on the east side of the Hudson River that the Palatines were settled in, included Hunterstown, and then Haysbury, Queensbury, and Ansbury going north. East Camp came to be the name, one of the names for this village that we now call Cheviot, a hamlet really. So in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, it was known as East Camp as kind of a memorial to the Palatine era, which is 100 plus years prior to that. I talked about it a bit during my Cheviot talk a couple of years ago about the name change in the late 1800s. Between 1888 and 1891, the name of this hamlet changes from East Camp to Cheviot, which is what we know it by now. And the big event that caused that was the opening of the Cheviot Methodist Episcopal Church. And the proper title of that church included Cheviot on Hudson, New York, in the proper title of that church. And that church stood from 1891 until 1897, burned down at the hands of an arsonist in 1897, was rebuilt immediately after that, and the church closed in 1939 and sold the building to the American Legion, and it continues to be the American Legion Hall to this day. Now, the cemetery here, Bill and Sue Droge, a couple of years ago, donated a lot of money and time to standing a lot of the old gravestones up and put that column chain fence around the perimeter of the cemetery. They also purchased this sign, which, as you can see, it says East Camp Cemetery, Cheviot, 1710. And that is the official name on the old cemetery records. The Methodist church that opened in 1891 did function as a caretaker for the cemetery in the 40 or so years that it was open. So I love the sign, but it does kind of add to the confusion that genealogists and other local historians, people who poke around looking for ancestors, but don't necessarily know the regional history intimately, will be a little bit confused by the sign because it goes back to an older name, but it also has the newer name on there as well. And just briefly, Cheviot is the name of a mountain range, the Cheviot Hills in Scotland, which can be seen from the ancestral home of the Livingston family, Ancram, Scotland. And that's in large part why this hamlet is called Cheviot, is because the money for the Methodist church was put up by Robert Edward Livingston, who died in around 1891, and part of his estate went to the church. Now, before this sign used to be where the previous sign was. These signs are around Germantown. They were put up, I think, around 2007, 2008. It was part of an economic development initiative. And this is on the backside of the cemetery now, on Cheviot Road side. And again, this is almost designed to confuse genealogists on the other side of the country. It's a nice sign. Moving on, this is the sign at Palatine Park. This was not a state education department sign from the 1930s. This was one of the legacies of the Bicentennial Committee from 1975, 6, 7 in Germantown. One of the great accomplishments that they got done back then was the publication of Walter Miller's History of 18th Century Germantown. And this was, I say, arguably the second greatest accomplishment from back then. This was right around the time that Edward and Friedel Eckert donated 24 acres of land to the town of Germantown for the purposes of building Palatine Park. So for the most part, the history on this is pretty solid. The number, sometimes you see a little bit different number, 1484. And then the other thing, some historians will pick a bone with the word refugees. And, it's disputed somewhat whether they were actually fleeing war or famine or just coming for economic opportunity. But that's true of any migration of people. Now this is about what all of Palatine Park looked like in 1977, before the park was really developed. One of the very first things that was done after the town acquired the property from the Eckerts was the building of the road. The old Bell Road used to come in from 9G, and they built a road coming off of Main Street to connect the old Bell Road. And I love this picture because Mr. and Mrs. Eckert are in there in the middle looking up at the sign. The late Mr. Charles Ramsey is there. George Sharp, supervisor of the town at the time, is here in this picture as well. And this is all playground. The war memorials are here now. The playground is here in the background as well. Town hall is over here. None of this was there at this time when the sign went in. I believe so. I repainted the sign in the summer of 2022. I don't think it had ever been painted since 1977. If it was, it might have been painted once since its original paint job. But it's set up pretty high. I had to use a 6-foot ladder to get up to. So generally speaking, the higher that a sign is set on a pole, the further away it is from getting sprayed by rock salt. And it's not on a heavily trod road, so it's not going to get plastered with rock salt. And it's a good bit away from the road as well. So it just doesn't get as rusty as some of the other signs I'll show you. Now this one is at the bottom of Linlithgow Hill on 9G, where the roll-off Jansen Kill goes underneath 9G. This one was one of the forgotten signs in a way. It's not in Germantown, it's in Livingston. It's on the Livingston side. And this thing was covered in wild grape. I had to cut that. First thing was cut that back. I don't think I have a picture of the slide here, but it was extremely rusty. It had been missed definitely the last time, and probably the last 2 or 3 times that the county came through and repainted all these signs. And it really cleaned up nice. I was shocked that there's no old weld repairs on this one. It's just a rusty one. And luckily, this one's set a little bit lower, but it's enough off the road. And I think that's what saved it. But it's tucked away. It's, people are flying by at least 60 miles an hour. It's not often seen. And the history there is pretty solid as well. The town's 1788 is the law. New York State passed a law kind of defining the responsibilities of all towns in New York State, 1788. So that's any town that existed at that time pretty much dates to 1788. The manor, Livingston Manor, was granted by Governor Dongan to Robert Livingston the Elder in 1686. District status 1772, that was conferred by the provincial government of colonial New York, 1772. And then Claremont, Gallatin, Granger, that was the original Livingston district. Granger was the original name of the town of Taconic. That changed very early 1800s, I believe. And Germantown became its own district immediately prior to the Revolutionary War, 1775. And that part of Claremont added in 1858 is the northern tip of Germantown. The line went from about where Ernest R. Lasher Jr. Park is now on the Hudson River, from a point just north of there called Roberts Point, out over towards Dales Bridge Road, cut off the very northern tip of Germantown. It was added by an act of the state legislature in 1858 to Germantown. That's the identical sign, but this is on Dales Bridge Road on the Livingston side of Dales Bridge. And this one still looks a little kind of sorry. It was blasted with a shotgun at some point over the years. And it looks as good as it can look now, but it was extremely rusty, very faded paint before I retouched this one in 2022. Now this one got repainted in 2021 by Bruce Bonsack. So I don't have I didn't paint this one, so I don't have a modern picture of this one, but this is a photograph from back in 2002. The old bus garage is still just north of there on 9G. This is the southern outlet of Sharps Landing Road. And the diner is there now. The bus garage has been torn down. There's a diner behind there now. And this sign, a little bit misleading in that refers to the Protestant Dutch in Germantown. By that, the Palatine Germans who settled here in 1710. Back in the 30s, it was pretty common to refer to those Palatine Germans as Dutch, which is a corruption of the word Deutsch, meaning German. So that was kind of used as a shorthand, and many people of Palatine German descent preferred to be known as Dutch. They kind of embraced the confusion. In part, for some of them, they would rather be identified with the early New York Dutch rather than with the what were called the poor Palatines. The very literally dirt poor Palatines who were here in 1710, 11, 12, and had to struggle mightily in the years after that here in East Camp. The 1728 date, so the Reformed Church, they date their beginning to 1728, and that's when they finally got a minister of their own choosing in 1728. People who held to the Calvinist doctrines of the early Reformed Church were present here in 1710, but they were under the wing of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, led by Reverend Hager in East Camp, Germantown. And he passed away in the early 1720s. There was a successor to him who ministered under the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Finally, in 1728, the people of the Reformed faith here in East Camp got a minister of their own choosing. And it was a man named Johannes van Driesen, who's a man of Dutch extraction. So you have their first reverend is the Dutchman, and virtually everybody in the congregation was of Palatine German descent at that point. And the location given on that sign, we've never found a primary document that pinpointed the exact location. There's some things from the very earliest days of Germantown that are just either the primary document is lost or the primary document is not as crystal clear as we'd like. But the Reformed cemetery is in the triangle formed by Sharps Landing Road and Sharps Landing Extension. The church will be a little bit closer towards 9G, literally 500 feet west of that sign. That's where Walt Miller thought it was. The interesting thing, if it was on that piece of land, it was on the land of John Christopher Quartz, who was a prominent Lutheran. So there's a little bit of an odd wrinkle if that location is accurate. Now, this is from, I mentioned Walt Miller's History of 18th Century Germantown earlier. This is his drawing. There's on the 1798 John Wegram map of Livingston Manor, including Germantown. He made a very tiny little sketch of the churches, including the First Reformed Church. And Walt Miller, who was also he would try his hand at charcoal drawing, did this sketch from that. It was painted red. We know from primary sources it was painted red. It was dismantled shortly after the church moved in 1814. And this is where they moved to in 1814. There's another sign that Bruce Montack painted in 2021. This is an old shot from back in 2002. This is the top of the hill on Main Street in Germantown. And that good sign, solid sign, but doesn't give you a whole lot beyond just the date. And that's the Second Reformed Church of Germantown. That's all in the cemetery now. If you go up into the old, what we call the old section of the cemetery, the oldest graves are just a little bit about where the cameraman was in this photograph, looking back at the church. The church faced east. So the back of this church would have been kind of right up next to the Route 8 to Main Street. If you go drive through there or walk through there, there's a bit of a circular drive, and that circle was right in front of the front door of the church here. So it's all, that's the highest spot of the hill. And after the church moved again in 1880, they built the current Reformed Church in 1880, moved down the hill. This building was sold to the Miller family in Lithgow and reassembled as a barn and used for many years until about 1980, 1990, somewhere in there, that was torn down. But after the current church was built in 1880, all of the spots, all the grave plots here were sold at a pretty hefty premium, I would say, because all the people buried where the church was were all very prominent people in town in the late 19th century or early 20th century. Now, this is the sign for the parsonage, what we call the parsonage, which was the first Reformed church parsonage associated with the first church I showed you a few slides ago. It was not built until 1767. That first church, first Reformed church, was built before 1740. So we're talking a good 40 years or so before the ministers of the Reformed Church had a place to live right nearby, paid for by the congregation. And this is home of the Germantown History Department. My office is in here. And this is a famous photograph of the parsonage from the very early 1900s, taken by Court Myers. The Eckert family that donated Palatine Park to the town of Germantown owned this building from the mid-1940s on until their deaths in 1989. And At this point in the early 1900s, the exterior there is still stone, and the house is very much the same, except the Eckarts coated that stone, and all the mortar holding it together had deteriorated quite a bit by the mid 1940s. So they basically stuccoed it in with cement, and that's the exterior of the old, the older section of the house today. Now this sign's located on Church Avenue, almost right in front of the Third Reformed Church, and this one confuses the facts a little bit. There was a schoolhouse built in 1711. Reverend Hager from the society that I mentioned earlier, he requested a certain amount of lumber from Robert Livingston the Elder to build a church. At that time, the Reformed Church and the SPG were both, they provided grammar schools to the community. There would be some ecclesiastical training and theological work as well, but they would teach kids through the 8th grade. And that was in fact built in 1711. However, that school was located over by Sharp's Landing Road, where the churches were, the early churches, and the one of the early villages of Queensbury. The schoolhouse that was on the site here, that's marked by this sign, was built about 1798, and that was the first secular public school in Germantown. Was located where the sign is located, but that didn't happen in 1711. That happened much later in 1798. Not included in this slideshow, but also nearby in the town of Claremont, there's a sign for the first public school in New York State, and that is from 1791, and that actually is an accurate sign. Claremont got one in part because of the influence of Chancellor Robert R. Livingston at that time, and also the fact the town of Claremont didn't have any churches, and by extension, they didn't have any grammar schools affiliated with any church, because there was no church in the town of Claremont. So between that and Chancellor Livingston's connections, he was able to get the first secular public school in New York State, built in the town of Claremont in 1791. And by 7 years later, the time of the Wheatgram map, there is a schoolhouse right where the sign is, but it is most certainly not there in 1711. Now this sign is on Main Street. If you follow Main Street out, it becomes County Route 8. And this is the home of Simon Rockefeller. His wife was named Anna. And he's a son of Deal Rockefeller Sr. Deal Rockefeller Sr. was a so-called late Palatine. He arrived in 1733, 20 plus years after the main wave of Palatines who came to his camp. Deal Rockefeller Sr. had a first cousin who, by the name of Johann Peter Rockefeller, who also came from Germany around that, the German principalities around that time, and settled in New Jersey. And this is the house. This is an old photograph of the house. So like I said, Deal's cousin, Johann Peter Rockefeller, settled in New Jersey. Several generations later, their great-grandchildren, a pair of their great-grandchildren, Godfrey Rockefeller and I believe Christina Rockefeller, got married. They're third cousins. They got married in one of the front rooms of the house here. They later moved on to Richford, New York, and where their grandson, John D. Rockefeller Sr., was born. This is pretty typical of like late 18th century, early 1800s building. Most of what you see today for that house dates to 1808. The original portion, the very tiny little portion of the back corner of this house, is thought to date from 1755. And this building was used as a tavern, and also from 1808, the first documented town board meeting took place here in 1808. Say representative government came slowly to Livingston Manor and Germantown. The Livingston family in particular kept quite the stranglehold on local politics in the early days of the Republic. And local government in Germantown was basically a court, a Livingston Manor court dominated by the Livingston family until 1808, when we got a town board and representative government here in town. This sign no longer exists, I'm sad to say. A car hit it in early 2022, smashed it into a whole bunch of pieces, almost got the mailbox, 100 or 200 feet north of there. This is on 9G. And this marked the first Lutheran church, but 9G, as you know from the Lost Cemeteries talk a couple of years ago, 9G pretty much perfectly bisects the Lutheran cemetery associated with this church. And this is from Walt Miller as well, the former town historian, a sketch of the first church as it looked. So this faced west. It would have had, an amazing view. You can see the cemetery. The cemetery was said to have taken up quite a bit of land to the immediate south of the church. And this, again, the primary sources are a little murky about the exact building date, but I believe it was prior to 1740. The Cadwallader Colden property division map from 1740 shows a very small lot in the spot where this church was. Now, I mentioned grant writing at the beginning, and this was one of the signs that I successfully wrote a grant for to replace the sign since they got destroyed last year. And this is what I came up with: the church and cemetery, marking the church and the cemetery, because I think it's important to include the cemetery on there as well. The Lutheran Church dates its founding to 1710, and Reverend Cokerthal came over with the Palatines and was here. He was always based out of West Camp, but he was here before Reverend Hager was. Reverend Hager's on one of the later boats. And so they, unlike the Reformed church, for the reasons I outlined earlier, they were there in 1710 as well, but they didn't have the church they wanted until 1728. The Lutherans, on the other hand, they date right from 1710. The building, so there was a Union church. There was a building that the Reformed and Lutherans shared prior to, say, 1728 at least. And like I said, I look at the Colden map and I see a tiny little lot where the Lutheran church was. So I extrapolate from that there was the building by 1740. The move to Viewmont in 1812 is a little bit better documented. We have the votes. The congregation took a vote on whether to stay in Queensbury where they were. and rebuild that church, knock it down, rebuild it, refurbish, whatever. And the other vote was to move to Viewmont, and all of the Lashers and Denigers and a few other families that lived down closer to Viewmont outvoted by quite a bit the families that wanted to stay in Queensbury. And so the church moved to Viewmont, where it is now. And like we outlined in the Lost Cemeteries talk, the cemetery was destroyed by the farmer who owned it at that time. By the 1930s, when Route 9G was wide, the roadbed was widened, scoured out, and the hillside was kind of scarred up. They found bodies, they found caskets, they found gravestones in the 1930s. So the stones were all destroyed, piled up, buried, whatever happened to them. 50 years later, nobody alive knew about it anymore, and the road workers carved up the cemetery, and now we drive through there every day. So I'm hopeful that the sign will give some more context than the previous sign did. This is the sign for the third Lutheran church. There's no sign for the second. So a couple of problems with this sign. Now there's no D in department on this sign. So this is kind of like a factory defect along with this sign. This sign looks to me like it got smashed with a plow at some point. There's a huge, you can see that weld mark running right down the middle of it, enormous weld, a beautiful weld, but this thing was broken almost in half. You can see my painting supplies. This is from last summer. And this just has one coat of yellow on at this point. This is a very difficult sign to paint just because of all the painting around that weld, trying to get a little bit of that H in there so people can read it, a little bit of the W on there. So the 1812 year, as we know from the previous sign, that's when the Lutherans moved from Queensbury to Viewmont. And when they moved there in 1812, they built this church. This is a sketch of the second church. Walt Miller, back in the 1930s, I'm thinking, interviewed an old gentleman who remembered what the second church looked like. And from the notes he took then, this was how the gentleman described it. So this is the church that stood in Viewmont as the Christ Lutheran Church from 1812 to, I believe, mid 1860s is when the current church, this is the third Lutheran church. So that sign for the third Lutheran church really should have the date of, I believe it's 1867, when that church was opened. You can see, I believe, if you see there's a little bit of a low sloping roof there. I believe that is the old horse stable for the church. There's a long foundation wall in the hillside there, all covered up with trees now. But that long foundation wall is still there. And before cars, people needed stables at the churches to keep their horse out of the weather during the church services. This was another sign that I wrote a grant to replace. This one still stands along 9G, right, basically in the parking lot of the diner, a little bit north of the First Reformed Church sign. So this sign has always been a little bit of a touchy subject at the history department. Like I've hinted at, for the other signs, the Palatine migrations in 1709, 1710, the first Palatine Germans arrived in East Camp in October 1710. There's nobody here there's no Europeans here in 1684, with the exception of uh, Robert Livingston the Elder. Uh, he negotiated with some of the local Mohican Indian chiefs in 1683. He purchased several hundred acres from those Mohican chiefs in 1683, both on the river, including Germantown and the mouth of the Rojan, and also a piece called Taconic, several hundred acres on the eastern half of southern Columbia County. But for him, there's really no Europeans around in 1684. The name Sharp was originally Sherb, Jacob Sherb. And so I think what happened is in the 1930s, whoever wrote the sign was either looking at a map or looking at the history of Columbia County. And there's a hamlet in the town of Stuyvesant, New York. And that hamlet is called Sharptown. And there was one boatload of Swedish immigrants came to the town of Stuyvesant in 1683. And one of their names was Sharp, and one of the last names was Sharp, and one of the last names was Best. And both of those names were also among the Palatines in 1710. Obviously, we have Sharp's Landing Road here in Germantown. On the southern end of town, we also have the Best Lane, named for those families. There were also Swedish families in the town of Stuyvesant by those last names as well. So I believe the writer of the sign confused the two places, seeing a Sharp's Dock or a Sharp's Landing that close together in Columbia County. And that's where I think the 1684 year comes from. I think the writer had the two places confused. In the primary documents for relating to Germantown specifically, it's almost never called Sharp's Landing. It's almost always called Sharp's Dock. So that's why when I wrote the text for the new sign that'll replace this one, I call it Sharp's Dock rather than Sharp's Landing. And that's I mentioned the original spelling of Sharp is Sherb. This eventually became a P, and then it eventually became Sharp. And some of this family had an E at one point as well. Jacob Sherb, so he passed away before the division of property in 1740. He was a trader and a merchant, from newspaper, in very rare extant newspaper record from the 1730s, described him as a trader and a merchant. But like I said, he was crossing the Row Jansen Kill, about where the manor house, the Livingston Manor House was. So we're in the ballpark of the Route 9G bridge over the Row Jansen Kill. It was winter time, January, February, in the mid 1730s. And whether he fell through the ice or what, both he and the horse died, passed away, as a result of crossing the Rojan during the icy months. They found his body on the shoals closer to the mouth of the Row Jansen Kill, where it comes out into the Hudson River. So in the 1740 division of property, you'll see his son George on the property records there, and that's a rough approximation for the property that Jacob Sherb owned, is his son George Sharp on those records from 1740. And now his grandson Peter more or less wound up with the dock and the old Sharp house, and quite a bit of that land in the Sharp's Landing Road area. He lived into in the early 1800s, 1820s, I believe. And then the old dock was destroyed by the railroad in 1851. It's a bit of a debate where exactly it was. Yeah, I'm of the mind that it was somewhere off the northern end of Sharp's Landing Road, about in line with the old Sharp house. But other people think it's kind of like dead middle of Sharp's Landing Road, and some people are of the thought that it was on the southern end of Sharp's Landing Road, going down towards the river. This is another one of the historic signs mangled by a plow in the early 2000s, and it's been at the Germantown History Department ever since. This used to be on Lower Main Street. Devin might remember as a very young child, about where the bank building, the empty bank building, was on the back side of their property. About where it should be. If anything, it might be just a little bit further west on Lower Main Street. And it's the site of the old mills erected by D.L. Rockefeller. The year 1751, D.L. Rockefeller Sr. mentioned earlier, emigrated in 1733. In the division of property 1740, he owns no property whatsoever. None of the land in 1740 is deeded to him. By the time he dies in 1769, he owns 10% of the acreage in Germantown. And a big part of what generated the wealth necessary to acquire all that land was in 1751, he acquired a very small piece of land, but a very important piece of land about where the Dollar General is now, wrapping around kind of and meeting the creek that runs parallel to Lower Main Street. And that creek snakes up its way up along Main Street, parallel to the school. And that creek is what generated all of D.L. Rockefeller, a lot of D.L. Rockefeller's early wealth here. So 1751, that piece of land is acquired. And like all the 1700s era occurrences in Germantown, the primary documents are a little bit sketchy, sometimes a little bit not as enlightening as we would hope them to be. But that property acquisition in 1751 is given as the date for when the mills were built. Now, Russ Deniger passed away in I think 2012. He grew up in that area, and he can remember the old mill pond. He can remember ice skating on the old mill pond because there was enough of the dam left in his childhood in the 1930s that it held back enough water in the wintertime that he could ice skate. He and the other kids in the neighborhood could ice skate on the old mill pond. And this is the third sign. We'll have a new one later this year. This is what I went with for the text. Couldn't fit the entirety of the old description in the first line, so grist sawmill, and described D.L. Rockefeller Sr. as a late Palatine. I always throw D.L. Rockefeller Sr. in there to distinguish him from his son, D.L. Rockefeller Jr. And also threw in there that this is the primary reason Main Street became the center of Germantown. Now, the lower Main Street area was the old Haysbury Palatine camp in 1710. But it was not the most important part of town until the very late 1700s. And even then, it's really more the early 1800s that Main Street kind of becomes the center of town. And virtually all of that land running up Main Street all the way out to the Simon Rockefeller house that we profiled earlier, that was all land that was gobbled up by D.L. Rockefeller Sr. and his descendants. Um, and almost any house along Main Street, if it's from that era, or even partially from that era, almost guaranteed to have some sort of Rockefeller connection. No, I'm not going to talk about Spook Rock. This is on Spook Rock Road, just outside of Hudson, New York. But one of the fourth sign that I successfully acquired through a grant over the winter time was a Legends and Lore sign. So there's only 2 of these right now in Columbia County. The one we see here for Spook Rock, and the other one is by the Van Allen House in Kinderhook for the character of Ichabod Crane. Was based on Jesse Merwin, a school teacher from Kinderhook. So the third one in Columbia County is coming to Germantown. And this is what it will read. And it's about Reverend Hager, who I mentioned a little bit earlier. The former historian Walt Miller wrote a recollection of a folk tale that was told to him when he was young about the master of time and space, who, the story, as the story goes, took Reverend Hager up into the sky. He was despairing. You know, he wasn't an old man when he died, but he was kind of broken in body and in spirit, and somewhat dejected that, you know, things didn't pan out quite how he wanted in Germantown. So as the story goes, the master of time and space took Reverend Hager up into the heavens and showed him visions of how Germantown would look 50 years in the future, and 100 years in the future, and 200 years in the future. And Reverend Hager has mustered the strength to give one last great sermon the following Sunday, and then died a couple of days after that. I always loved that story, and I think this is one of Walt Miller's best charcoal drawings. So that's what I submitted a grant for a Legends and Lore sign based on that story, and the New York Folklore Society, which judges for the William G. Pomeroy Foundation. They accepted the texts, played with it a little bit, which they always do, and, but they enhanced it. They didn't take away from what I had written. They made it better. So that'll go up. I'm probably going to put that up in the old Reformed cemetery, because the town actually owns that piece of property, and we already have a historic marker that was put up in 2022 to mark the cemetery. This is one of just 2 historic signs from outside of Germantown that I'll profile. And this is to profile the repainting process. So like I said, I repainted 27 signs last summer. So this is what's it called? It's the Livingston Memorial Chapel of Linlithgow, I believe it's called, is the proper name. And it was originally built in the 1720s, I believe. And then the crypt where the early Livingstons, including Robert Livingston the Elder, been talking about, the immediate descendants of him and his wife Alida are all buried in the crypt below this church. But the first church on the site was dismantled when the church moved to, and there was just the Reformed church in the village of Livingston, then called Johnstown. And then around 1870s when they rebuilt the chapel on this site, which is the current church that stands there now. But somebody took issue with the fact that the Livingston name was on there. Like I said, the Livingstons very grudgingly and very slowly gave up political power in the early years of the Republic. They not in Germantown. Germantown is a freehold town, but everything else in southern Columbia County was rented land that the tenants who rented it would have to pay a rent to the Livingston family, the various members of the Livingston family as they inherited the land, and just created a lot of bad blood. In the earliest decades of the Republic, there was no secret ballot. You would go to the polling place if you were eligible to vote, and you'd have to declare your vote publicly and openly in front of everybody. And the Livingstons themselves or representatives of the Livingstons would be there to keep track of who voted for who. Very often the votes would go whichever way the Livingston family wanted them to go. They would do things like increase the rent on tenants who voted against their preferred candidates. And this graffiti is just kind of a legacy of the bitterness from those years. Somebody just whited out the name Livingstons and left it as the burial place of generations. Now there is a cemetery in the backyard of this church. Well, some of the graves are very old, but all of the Livingston family, the earliest generations of the Livingston family, are buried in the basement, in the crypt below this church. So the first step was scraping and using a wire brush to get all the loose paint and rust off of these signs. Next step is painting them with blue paint. The New York State Education Department recommends Rust-Oleum Royal Blue as the blue and Sunburst Yellow as the yellow for the lettering. So this is kind of like step one. If it's not too rusty, not too much flaking paint, you can get away with maybe 10 minutes or so of scraping and wire brushing. Some of the tougher signs, the longest I had to scrape on a sign was about an hour. I'll show you that one, how it looked beforehand. This one wasn't too bad. This is one of the 1930s era cast iron signs, and they will rust, but they hold the paint pretty nicely. They're relatively porous, so the paint kind of soaks in there kind of nicely. I apply the blue paint with a paintbrush, and you just have to be careful for drips. I go back over those letters quite a bit because the paint gets in all those little nooks and crannies, and then wants to drip out after. So I put the initial application of paint on, and then I very often have to go back over and kind of smooth out the drips before they dry in place. And then there's how it looks after 2 coats of yellow paint. The lettering on this sign in particular is very prominent. The letters stick out really far from the surface of the sign. That Palatine Park sign that I showed you earlier, the letters are not prominent at all. So that one is extremely difficult to letter, to put the yellow paint on. This sign I could press quite hard with the roller. I use a small roller to do the lettering, and this one was a piece of cake. Palatine Park I can barely press at all. And in the ideal conditions to do this sort of work are, like it was last summer, 90 degrees, 60 degrees overnight and 90 degrees during the day, no rain whatsoever for weeks. That's kind of perfect conditions for painting. But that Palatine Park sign, like I said, the letters didn't stick out very much at all from the sign, so it was very difficult to letter that one. This one, on the other hand, is a piece of cake, and that came out pretty nice. Now this one, this is the often called Manorton Church, the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church at the corner of what are the roads? County Route 19 and County Route 8. This is the successor to the old Tarbush Church that I think I've talked about in some previous talks. So the church has been on, this Lutheran church has been on this site since 1861. The current church dates 1901. I believe former town of Livingston and Columbia County historian Mary Howell was responsible for getting a grant to put this sign up in the early, maybe mid 1990s. And this had not been painted, I don't think, since its original paint job either. This is not, this is, I believe, aluminum. This is not, this is a different kind of metal than the old time cast iron signs. These were popular at a time, and they're still popular with new signs. The nice thing about them is they won't rust. However, they're not as porous as the old signs. So the paint, as you can see, the paint has a tendency to potato chip off like in big flakes. And that's exactly what happened with this one here. So I spent an hour. So this is just one side. The other side is almost as bad. An hour later, wire brushing and scraping. And so I do all this work in place. Some people, you know, if the county is doing this work, oftentimes they'll take the sign to their shop, they'll sandblast it. I don't have the wherewithal to be sandblasting on the side of the road. So I just use a scraper and a wire brush and get the majority of it off. And this one required a lot of prep work. This is one of the very few that I actually used a spray paint primer on here because I didn't think the way that surface was, I didn't think the paint would stick on there without a coat of primer on there first. So that's how it looked after the first coat of blue. This is one of the few signs that I didn't paint the whole pole because the pole had never been painted, so I didn't bother. But the old ones, oftentimes are painted black or dark blue, and they often look pretty scabby as well. So I usually paint the whole pole along with it. And that's how that one came out. That one came out beautifully. Again, a newer sign, the letters aren't super prominent. You know, it was a little bit tricky to letter that one. And it's a little tricky to paint in these curves. You see these divots kind of. It's tricky, but it's not quite as hard as it looks. So those are just two examples from out in Livingston for the repainting process. That's all I have for tonight. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat or you can ask them in person in a moment. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can email me at germantownhistory@gmail.com. You can follow the history department on Instagram at Germantown History. Our website is germantownnyhistory.org. And we also have a bunch of old oral histories on YouTube at Germantown History.
Question. I should have make me. Yeah, I can't read all that. I do see like someone says, do you have any information about the Shepherd Bridge historic marker?
Yes. I don't have a great handle on that history. This is in Livingston, the bridge over the Klein Kill, about just a little bit up from where it dumps into the Olaf Jansen Kill. That's the site of the old fish hatchery, the New York State fish hatchery that's in that area. I've heard some conflicting information about the Sheffer Bridge historic marker. That one's on my to-do list. It's close to home, and it's not in bad shape, but it looks like it got plastered with salt. It's got a big white glow to it. So that one I think would be better served if it was up a little bit higher. And that's another one. That's a case where I think that's why Pomeroy Foundation and the other foundations limit the text on the sign now, because the Sheffer Bridge sign, I don't know if you've ever looked at it, but the letters are extremely tiny. There's a solid paragraph of information on this. So writing a sign, you really want to be brief. You want to convey as much information as possible with as few words as possible. Less is more when it comes to these signs. And the Sheffer Bridge has way too many words on it. But that's on my to-do list to repaint next year, or this year, I should say, next one.
Carl wrote, great presentation and thank you for your work. I recall reading and hearing of the fire in the early 1900s. As I recall, started in the Grange Hall, seemingly extinguished, but they didn't check all the high spots. Fire then took hold again, spread through much of the village. Off topic for this presentation, but I can find little documentation of it, and hope you or anyone else may comment. Fingers crossed, can be a separate and welcome presentation by itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a good idea.
So the YouTube channel that I mentioned earlier, we have a oral history given by Dow B. Hover a few years before he passed away. He was there at the fire. So he's, as far as I know, that's the only firsthand account of the fire that survives today. So my understanding was it did start in the Grange Hall. A custodian was sweeping up under the stage, and he swept, rather than sweep up the pile, put it in the garbage can, he just kind of took the easy way and just swept it under the stage.
Mm.
There was a stage where they would show movies in the early days of motion pictures at the Grange Hall. They would show movies there, and he just swept the floor, swept all the debris under the stage. Among the debris was a partially lit cigarette. And so once he swept it under there, it lit the other stuff that he swept on fire. And yeah, that's the story of how the Great Fire in 1923 started. That started in the Grange Hall. Supposedly, the fire was under control, and somebody smashed out a window in the Grange Hall, one of the firefighters who responded, and that's what caused the fire to come roaring back to life. Was smashing out that window caused the fire to have an oxygen source, and that's how it got going again. These are the stories as they came down through the years. The Hudson Daily Star covered the fire November 15th, 1923. I don't know if that's available online anywhere, but I do have a digital copy of it in the Germantown History Department. If you send me an email, I can send you the front page. You may be able to find in some of the newspaper archives online. You may be able, if you look for November 1923, you may be able to find other articles about it. I have 8 to 10 photographs of the fire. Just did a post about it on our Instagram page and our Facebook page.
And Tom, this is a good point too. So this is Tom Shannon with the Germantown History Department. And Saturday you have hours that you're open. So
yeah, you can come visit any Saturday morning. We're open 9 a.m. till noon at the old Reformed Parsonage, 52 Maple Avenue, Germantown, New York.
The other day I went through County Route 10 through Linlithgow, and I saw the Burden sign was repainted. Did you do that?
I did, yeah. Of
Thank you. Thank you very much.
course, yeah. I hit County Route 10, almost all of it, I think.
Yeah. This is Wendy from the Livingston Free Library, and I had a talk which I wanted to have on Iron Mountain. And
Okay.
Joe Gotti, our town historian, said, well, you have to do a talk about Burden.
Yeah,
And I had no idea there was a whole hamlet there, which only a brick building is still standing. There were
Yeah.
4 saloons, 1 school, 1 post office, and it was amazing how Iron Mountain really started. And I'm glad that you did the sign over again. So I want to thank you for that.
thanks, Wendy. I visited the old Burden Cemetery. There's actually a cemetery associated with Burden. And me and a couple other guys from the history department, we walked through a farm field, and it's in a pretty deep forest now. And last summer was very dry. There's almost no rain for 8 weeks or whatever it was. And because it was so dry, I was able to go down into one of the old mines, mine number 2, about 100 feet down before it reached water level. But most years, most summers now, it rains like crazy all summer. And the mine entrance itself, you could swim in it. But last year was so dry, I was able to get about 100 feet down into the mine.
You're a brave guy.
How long did it take you to paint all these signs? Was it 3 months, 4 months?
I think I did them in about a month and a half to 2 months. It requires 3 stops usually. Prep work takes 10 to 20 minutes typically, scraping and wire brushing. Then another 15 minutes maybe to paint the blue paint on the sign. And then wait for that to dry, come back the next day or 2 days later, do the first coat of yellow and the letters and the borders, and then come back another day or 2 later and do a second coat of yellow. And that's typically how it goes. So looking 2.5 to 3 hours of work on each sign, and then drive time, which drive time wasn't too bad as I started, but as I got further out into Livingston and Claremont, it took a while. So I like when there's like 5 or 6 signs right together, like Claremont, Route 9 and Claremont, there's 6 signs right in a row. And in the village of Livingston this summer, there's 5 that are all really close. So that's kind of ideal. So I don't have to drive as far for each sign.
So how many more do you have to do?
I don't have to do anything,
You're
but
not-
I just enjoy it.
You enjoy.
Yeah.
So you'll be in Livingston. So he'll be by you, Wendy, then.
Yeah. So this program was cut by the state in late 30s, early 40s, I think, late during the Depression or war. All funding was cut for this program, and they also didn't put any money towards maintenance of these. So they're maintained by volunteers. At times in the past, county governments and town governments have taken up the mantle of repainting these signs, but for the most part, it's all volunteers.
So
What color is the blue and the gold? Is it New York blue?
Yeah. So
sunburst yellow and royal blue.
yeah, the New York State Education Department, recommends Rust-Oleum, royal blue, and Rust-Oleum sunburst yellow.
I remember my colors.
Yeah.
So I have a question, just so how are you on material supplies? Is there another way anybody can donate for you at this moment? Are you short anything?
It doesn't take a whole lot. Like I said, I did 27 signs with about $200. So if you want to throw some money in, you can just send me an email at germantownhistory@gmail.com if you'd like to, if you'd like to paint, or if you'd like to donate, or if you want to help out in any way.
Great. I think that's it for questions, but next month again, March 16th, 6 p.m. Revolution War.
Yeah, I'm going to cover the Revolutionary War in Germantown and a little bit in the surrounding towns, Claremont as well.
And then we'll try to put together a trivia night or something
Yeah,
fun.
maybe in April we'll do trivia night.
Yeah. So thank you, guys. Any other questions or anything? When will be the, oh, there you go.
Yeah, so we're working on that. If you have a question, a specific question, you can send it to palatines@germantownlibrary.org. We will be scanning the papers of the Hank Jones Library. We will be scanning those in the next couple of months, and we'll hopefully have them available online in the, by the middle of this year, I'm hoping.
Germantown history@gmail.com.
Yes, that's correct. Germantownhistory@gmail.com if you need to get in touch with me.
Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks so much.